All right. Hello, thank you very much for joining. I'm Majid. I'm a philosopher hailing from Ankara, Middle East Technical University, and I'm here today to speak about justice and how it could be captured in terms of free energy principle, Carl Friston's free energy principle, to be more precise. And without further ado, I'm going to share my presentation and cut to the chase. All right. So there are some Rawlsian reflections, and as I said, I'm from Middle East Technical University Department of Philosophy. And the main insight is that the free energy principle underwrites a theory of justice. And to start by something that I have seen Carl has been doing a couple of times, I start by saying that there are two paths to develop a theory of justice in terms of the free energy principle. There is an upward path and there is a downward path. And today I'm going to take the upward path to presentation of theory of justice as free energy minimization. So it starts from, so right now I put them side by side in parallel because I didn't have enough space. But imagine that the blue path is upward. So it starts from the free energy principle, the orthodox statement of the free energy principle. Then it moves to theory of selfhood and how free energy principle underwrites theories of selfhood and agency. Then it is not only about individual selves, but about communities of selves, so about groups of selves and agents. And it moves to a theory of social organization in terms of the free energy principle, in terms of minimization of shared expected free energy. So, which comes in terms of collective policy selection, how a group of agents endeavor together to minimize their expected free energy. And then I argue that this is tantamount, this corresponds to a Rawlsian theory of justice. And then there is the theory of justice as free energy minimization for you. The other path that I don't take in this talk, is the downward path. It starts from the standard version of Rawlsian theory of justice, Rawls theory of justice as fairness. Then it tries to address some of the main criticisms of Rawls' theory of justice, and it is subject to a number of different criticisms. And also its needs for objectivity, and it is in the other path, the path that we are not going to take in this talk. It is there that free energy principle is going to be introduced to show that how grounding Rawls' theory of justice in neurophysiological mechanisms of self-organization helps to address some of its main problems. And again, we are going to end up with a theory of justice as free energy minimization. And I think that either of these two paths could lead to a theory of justice in terms of free energy minimization. No, because I'm going to talk to people who are in the business of free energy principle, I think that it would be more intuitive from them to introduce the upward path. At the same time, I'm aware that it might become a bit boring for them because they are far better exercised. They are familiar with this theory far better than I am. And Carl is, of course, presents it always with his usual grace. So, and this is the structure of the talk. I'm going to give an overview of free energy principle. Then I'm going to show how it's underwrites theory of selfhood and agency, which also needs speaking about minimization of expected free energy rather than minimization of free energy per se. Then I'm going to speak about multi-scale nature of minimization of free energy. that it happens across diverse scales, individual and social. And then I show this corresponds to Rawls' theory of justice, and not only corresponds to Rawls' theory of justice, but also can be used to make some improvements on aspects of Rawls' theory. So in this talk, because I'm not going to discuss all of the possible improvements, I'm going to just address one specific improvement that comes in terms of discussion of maximin rule. And this is the motivation and aim of the talk. Justice is usually treated as an autonomous normative concept. So if you are a philosopher, you think of justice as something that doesn't have necessarily something to do with processes and mechanisms that are happening in the world of biotic systems. So something normative and perhaps to some extent transcending the domain of the biotic and cognitive system. This talk is going to take an explicitly naturalistic approach to the question of justice. So, and I do not think that I need to justify this move in this talk because I think that scientists are going to be more or less on the same page with me, on board with this move. But if I was talking to philosophers, possibly I would need to spend more time justifying the attempt to account for justice in biological term or neurophysiological term. And the main hypothesis that I'm going to return to again in the latter part of this lecture is that if the inferential architecture constitutive of individual self would plausibly extend to organized collectives, then principles of justice correspond to and are shaped by the requirement to regulate uncertainty and entropy over time. All right, this is a part that I could easily skip because, well, it is free energy principle, but I have to at least present it to some extent because of the recording, if not because of the present audience. So the living, or rather self-organizing system, regardless of whether they are biotic or not, persists by minimizing their variational free energy. And free energy bound surprise under generative model and action and perception jointly serve to reduce uncertainty about hidden states of the environment. Yeah, this is some technical presentation of free energy principle. As you can see, it is in gray and it is not very clear or bold. And it is usually how a philosopher like myself sees the formalism of free energy principle. It is all with, I mean, it usually flies over my head because of its neat technical nature. But there are also aspects of that that could be deciphered and appreciated by a philosopher like myself again. And these are parts that are in red. So you as scientists usually see these parts in red. I as a philosopher usually see the free energy principle in this shape. So free energy bounds the entropy of the system sample of the environment, and entropy represents the long-run average of surprisal. For self-organizing system to remain viable, this bound on surprisal must be kept low. And minimizing free energy couples perception and action, and free energy minimization constraints trajectories of a random dynamic attractor, countering dispersing effect of the environment. In other words, by minimizing their free energy, self-organizing system managed to resist the dispersing effect of the environment. Yeah, but minimization of free energy is not only about updating models of the simple organisms or simple systems, of the models that they have of their environment, but also it serves to represent how more sophisticated systems like you and I, can have more sophisticated models of the environment and make decisions, choose policies that evaluated in terms of the minimization of expected free energy. So in order to do so, this kind of sophisticated system represent counterfactual outcomes of action. and select the policy that optimizes the choice, the policy that minimizes expected free energy. So, which is the free energy of future consequences of their actions. So they represent counterfactual outcomes of their action, and then they choose a path of action that optimizes the decision. And it can be decomposed into two components: risk, which is the divergence between predicted and preferred state, and ambiguity, which is expected uncertainty about outcomes. And adaptive behavior trades off risk and ambiguity, exploitation, exploration, epistemic value, pragmatic value. Again, this is how a philosopher sees this. So this is how this is how you see this as scientists. Those of you who are scientists see the minimization of expected free energy of a policy, and this is how a philosopher sees it. And it comes from Friston and colleagues' authoritative paper, Sophisticated Inference. Most of the technicality that I present or sometimes misrepresent in this talk is coming from this paper. So, minimization of expected free energy corresponds to minimizing the quantity that trades off complexity and accuracy, risk and ambiguity again, and the complexity term penalizes divergence between posterior beliefs and prior commitments, and the accuracy term rewards conformity between beliefs and experienced or anticipated evidence. So, for a sophisticated agent, minimization of free energy or expected free energy is not only about exploiting the environment. It is also about exploration. So such agents prioritize epistemic information gain as a prerequisite for subsequent pragmatic exploitation. So it is not about exploitation only. It is not only about pragmatic value, but also about exploration, about epistemic value. And this is the technical bit that I'm going to return to, and I'm going to discuss some aspect of Rawls' theory of justice. So those far I have just stated the general conception of the free energy principle. Next stop is selfhood. So the self is a model that an organism or self-organizing system has about the modalities of the persistence of its body. So prediction error arises from conflict between visual, tactile, and proprioceptive signals, and this conflict could be resolved by selecting the hypotheses that best explain their common cause, which is a self. And agency is stated in terms of policy selection that maintains coherence between agent's model and the environment. From this perspective, the self is not a substance, but persistence of a particular inferential architecture or process that repeatedly returns to limited regions of a status spaces by regulating its own entropy. So self is explicated in terms of the hierarchically organized generative models that treat the organism itself as a latent cause of its sensory stream. And an explanation of how one have the experience of being in a specific point in a space and time comes in terms of the selfhood, because there is a unified, almost unified process, a self, that explains the unity of these experiences. And agency is explained in terms of sophisticated counterfactual prediction, the capacity of generative model to represent not only environmental transition, but also the map of evolution of its own future-oriented belief states and counterfactual outcomes of action, and eventually also bestowing upon the system the ability to choose amongst these counterfactual outcomes, the one that is more consistent with its expectations. So the basic ideas of the free energy principle are covered now. Selfhood and agency is covered very quickly. And next step is the multi-scale nature of free energy minimization. The same inferential architecture that is in place in individual organisms can be instantiated at higher scales, and networks of agents form collective system with shared or aligned generative models, and free energy minimization could apply to a specific individual, but also at a higher level scale as well, to a specific uh, groups of cells or to group of individuals that form societies and community. And stability requires a balance between complexity and accuracy at each scale, including the social scale. Because just as cells combine to form tissues and organs under shared generative model, individual agents bind into social structures by virtue of collective inferences. Yeah, and active inference has been applied to dyadic and group interactions, suggesting that coordination arises when agents mutually minimize free energy through shared models and communications. There are a number of references listed here, but I think that one of the main references that I'm depending here is Friston and Friss 2015 paper, a duet for one. Yeah, and the first time that I thought of applying free energy minimization to philosophical accounts of social order and so on was actually when I saw this illustration, the cover of Thomas Hobbes's book Leviathan by Abraham Bosey, if I pronounce the name correctly. Yeah, and the illustration was very interesting in the respect that it indicates a state as something that has its own specific identity, which is the collective of the identity of individuals that are included in the state. I'm going to return to this illustration later. So the multi-scale self-organization relies on blankets of blankets, so nested Markov blankets, where coordinated movement in living creatures act as an effective means to model or represent the causal situation in which living creatures find themselves. And collective uncertainty or entropy can be resolved by synchronizing predictive expectations such that joint attention, turn-taking, and other coordination dynamics can be characterized as mechanisms of suppressing socially distributed prediction error. Yeah, and these are Friston and Friss papers that I mentioned earlier. So, it can provide a nice account of social order. So institutions coordinate expectations and actions of agents, and collective regulation reduces socially distributed prediction error. Social norms stabilize long-run trajectories under uncertainty. So what follows? What follows is the main hypothesis of this talk. If the inferential architecture constitutive of individual selfhood plausibly extend to organized collectives, then principles of justice correspond to and are shaped by the requirement to regulate entropy or uncertainty over time in complex social organizations. And the main insight is that justice to the society is like the principle of self-organization to the body. Yeah, and I think that this is the insight that struck me when I first saw this noted. I mean, the cover of Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, and it led to a discussion, an attempt to model Hobbes' account of social order in chapter 5 of this book, Scientific Explanation, Causality, and Agency. So in this book, I argue that the need to have social stability. I mean, social stability itself could be explained in terms of the balance between two extremes. One extreme is complexity. I mean, it's anarchy when each individual pursues their own individual goals, and that would be the state of extreme complexity. The other extreme is tyranny or absolute monarchy when there is only one entity that enforces their will to the society. So at one end, there is extreme complexity, which is not very good for the society. At the other end is extreme simplicity or accuracy, and both of these could undermine social stability. And the trick of having a stable society is to strike the balance between these two extremes of simplicity and complexity. Yeah. And but in this talk, I'm moving beyond social stability as such, and I'm going to discuss the issue of justice, social justice. So I think that free energy principle could be used to also model that, represent that. And this is where I'm going to start to speak about Rawls' theory of justice. So, uh, so possibly Rawls has, I mean, very sorry. As everyone knows, Rawls is a very famous political philosopher and political scientist, and his theory of justice consists of some specific elements that I'm going to preview very briefly here. So the original position, a hypothetical choice situation in which rational agents deliberate about the basic structure of society under conditions of informational symmetry imposed by a veil of ignorance. And this veil of ignorance excludes knowledge of one's social position, natural endowments, and contingent advantages. I think that it could be modeled in terms of free energy principle. And there's a conjecture that I'm not going to dwell on right now. But and another element of Rawls' theory of justice are his two principles of justice. The first principle is the principle of equal basic liberties, which requires that each person enjoys an equal scheme of fundamental rights, such as liberty of conscience, freedom of expression, and political participation. And these liberties have a strict priority and are not exchangeable for social or economic gain or advantage. So this is one of the main principles. The second principle governs permissible inequalities and is divided into two clauses. The first, equality of opportunity, which requires that offices and positions be open to everyone under conditions that neutralize the influence of social background, one's social status, whatever. And the difference principle that requires that any remaining inequality be arranged so that they maximize the position of the least advantaged members of the society. So, and also the main thing, a theory of justice is also methodologically, so it is the methodological centerpiece or cornerstone of Rawls' theory. It is organized around reflective equilibrium, which is its main also justificatory device. It is an iterative process of mutual adjustment among considerate judgments about particular cases, candidate principles of justice, and relevant background theories until a stable coherence relation is achieved. So this is road mapping again. We are done with the preface now, and the main talk starts in 10 seconds, which is a joke, of course. I mean, we are only, I think that 15 minutes to that. So many people are going to put off by this because I have to delve into some details some philosophy of science details, but I'm going to skip them quickly. And the gentleman here is Nelson Goodman. The interesting thing about the reflective equilibrium is that it comes from philosophy of science and Nelson Goodman's justification of induction. Yeah. In order to justify induction, Nelson Goodman builds on predicate logic. So you basically use as predicate logic. And in order to justify induction, it has in philosophy of science, it has been a perennial problem how to justify induction. And Nelson Goodman's solution is to try to justify that in terms of coherence within our linguistic and conceptual practices. So he argues that legitimacy of inductive inference depends on the coherence of predicates that we use in projection. So I do not want to bore you with philosophical details of Goodman's project, but the important thing is that it basically invokes some linguistic and logical devices to account for to justify induction in some sort of coherence between the basis of induction and the consequence of induction, right? So, and it is based on coherence, basically. But recently, Ahti and I were trying to develop new defenses of induction, not in terms of, not by depending on orthodox logical and linguistic tools, but by invoking free energy principle and active inference. No, the main point is this. In order to, I mean, Rawls' statement of reflective equilibrium has been inspired by Nelson Goodman's reliance on logic and language, but it seems to me at least that is an outdated approach to philosophy of science and the problem of induction. On the other hand, it is possible to justify induction by invoking active inference. So why not to also restate reflective equilibrium in terms of active inference, which is something that seems to me to be quite feasible and plausible and promising. So take the aforementioned decomposition of variational free energy into complexity and accuracy, and now read the symbols in normative terms, in terms of reflective equilibrium. And here equilibrium is achieved when neither the priors, which are the principle in John Rawls' account of reflective equilibrium, nor the likelihood-driven updates, which are judgments, dominate, but are mutually stabilized. So just to reiterate the point, for Rawls, reflective equilibrium was mainly invoked to provide some sort of coherence between the main principle, philosophical and theoretical principles of justice, and considerate judgments. But it was the only thing that it was seeming to be achieved was some sort of coherence. We want to go beyond coherence, so we could use active inference to restate reflective equilibrium. Here, the KL divergence measures the information cost of revising one's background commitments principle, and in reflective equilibrium terms, this corresponds to resistance of established principle to ad hoc revision. So we want to revise the principles of justice, but we don't want to do them in an ad hoc way, only in order to achieve coherence. And I think that there could be nice examples of how using KL divergence, that is a part in the way that is used in active inference, to achieve that in a non-ad hoc way. And the expected log likelihood term can be used to measure how well the current beliefs explain observed or considered cases, considered judgments in Rawls' terminology. This corresponds to the fit between principle and particular moral judgment. So in this fashion, minimizing free energy principle implements a constraint adjustment. Beliefs are revised only insofar as doing so improves their explanatory adequacy with respect to specific cases. So this is one step for casting Rawls' theory of justice in terms of the free energy principle, and it leads to a measurable account of reflective equilibrium because it could be calculated in some detail, and it is also objective. So it is not based only on some sort of logical or linguistic coherence, but it is based on active inference that basically unifies that with biological and cognitive facts in the world. But I mean, it is a fleeting example. I don't want to dwell on that too more. The main case that I'm going to discuss with some details in the remaining 10 minutes is Rawls' maximin rule. So Rawls' maximin principle specifies that among alternative institutional arrangements, one should select the one whose worst feasible outcome is better than the worst outcome of all competitors. So it is introduced as a decision rule appropriate under condition of deep uncertainty, where probabilities over social positions and life prospect cannot be reliably assigned. And this maximin rule has been subject to a specific criticism by utilitarianists. So criticism is that Rawls' maximin rule violates the rationality constraint of expected utility that comes with expected utility theory. And here I'm referring to Harsanyi's classical criticism. So if agents in the original position are rational and represent uncertainty by single cardinal utility function over probabilistic social state, then they should maximize expected utility rather than focus exclusively on the worst outcomes. So on Harsanyi's view, Rawls illegitimately replaces probabilistic aggregation with an extreme form of risk aversion, which abandons von Neumann Morgenstern's axiom that defines rational choice under uncertainty. Consequently, Rawls' procedure is said to be inconsistent with the standard decision theory of utilitarianism. So, in order to appreciate that more, consider Harsanyi's example. Consider a case in which you have two patients and both of them are suffering from pneumonia. Now, patient A, and you have limited amount of medicine. So patient A is otherwise healthy and would reliably recover if treated, given the medicine, whereas patient B also suffers from terminal cancer and could go only a few months if be administered. So if you give the medicine to patient B because patient B has terminal cancer, their life will be prolonged only for a few months, whereas patient A is healthy and he could recover very quickly. So to which one you are supposed to give the medicine? And Harsanyi gives a resonating positive answer to the first option, to patient A. And utilitarian reasoning here is that we have to treat patient A because this yields the larger expected gain in aggregate health. And this is in conflict. This defies Rawls' maximum rule, according to which patient B is supposed to be treated insofar as B occupies the worst of position. And I'm going to say that casting Rawls' theory maximum rule in terms of active inference helps to defend Rawls' position against Harsanyi's criticism. So there are other options too in order to support Rawls' view. There are other options from decision theory. But I think that active inference has the edge over the others because it is not only a formal tool, but a theory of how actual biotic system manage to keep the amount of, to return their self-organization by keeping the amount of their entropy within the given boundaries. So sophisticated active inference, this is the essence of my answer. Sophisticated active inference subsumes von Neumann Morgenstern's expected utility. So von Neumann Morgenstern's expected utility theory is recovered as a special, unsophisticated case of the more general active inference framework. The expected free energy of policy is decomposed into intrinsic value or epistemic affordance and extrinsic value and pragmatic value. So in other words, expected utility in the sense of von Neumann and Morgenstern is only the extrinsic value or pragmatic value or exploitation part of a decision. So if our goal is to solely maximize extrinsic value by setting the intrinsic value to 0, then the choice that we make would be corresponding to maximization of von Neumann and Morgenstern's notion of expected utility if we put intrinsic value to 0. So when applied to Harsanyi's case, this means that von Neumann Morgenstern expected utility theory models rational action as the maximization of expected reward alone or expected utility alone. So I'm basically going to repeat what I said in the previous slide because I'm not sure how fluently I presented my case. So von Neumann Morgenstern expected utility theory models rational action as the maximization of expected reward alone. So it focuses on exploitation. Whereas active inference extend this picture by assigning equal formal status to information gain. So policies minimize expected free energy, which decomposes into extrinsic value and also intrinsic value. And von Neumann-Morgenstern is only the first part. So expected utility here is a special case of active inference. And in general, rational choice is not based only in taking the extrinsic value into account, but also considering that as in balance to intrinsic value. And it has some consequences for the choice that we make in the case of patient A and patient B. So in other words, the prior preference, the choice that we make has to also take into account expectations that one has about the social support that one receives when put in a specific situation. So most agents, I think that also you and I expect that if they become worse off, they will still receive assistance and recognition. So we hope that we are not going to be left to our own devices and say that, all right, let them live for a few months less, because trying to save them doesn't contribute to increasing expected utility as such. So these expectations that we have carry high precision because they are required for a stable cooperation. So if we want to, if you expect agents, in other words, to cooperate to contribute to social stability, to social security, you want to take their expectations into account. And most of us expect to also be taken care of when are in a worse off situation. So, and the policy that systematically deprioritize the worse off situation violates these high precision expectations and generates large and heavily weighted prediction errors. Because we would think that, all right, when we are in that situation, no one is going to take care of us. So why care and why contribute to social security? So the resulting informational cost then outweigh gains in aggregate reward, favoring policies that protect the worse off even when expected utility is higher, when intrinsic value is put into zero. And this is the conclusion of the talk. Justice as fairness arises from free energy minimization in social system. Rawlsian principle are a stable solution to collective optimization under uncertainty. And the result, by the result, I mean casting theory of justice in terms of free energy principle unifies neuroscience, theories of selfhood, and political theory within a single explanatory framework, which is free energy principle. So this is a general scheme of how it works. Rawls' theory of justice is subject to a specific limitation and criticisms. And I think that supporting that with free energy principle helps to overcome this objection and dissolve the problem, and also end up with a more objective and down-to-earth theory of justice. So, and the long-term goal of this project is to first, this phase, develop a theory of justice in terms of active inference. This is the pilot project. Then develop a new form of fair utilitarianism, which looks beyond expected utility, and then try to apply that to specific cases in ethics, governance, political science, and harvest the results. So thank you very much for your patience and your patience. I'm going to end up the talk here, and I will be very grateful if you can end up sharing my screen, because I can't do that myself.
Sure. Thank you, Majid. And while I stop sharing your screen, let us all unmute and maybe open our cameras and give Majid a well-deserved round of applause.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. That was
Thank
very,
you.
very kind of you. So let me close your screen.
Stop
Where
sharing.
is it?
I found it. I found the
That-
key. Yeah.
there you go. There you go.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah. This
Now it's
deserves an applause. Yeah. Thank you very much.
now we open our Q&A session, and any existing interest can be manifested via a raised hand, or just unmute yourselves and say something that you'd like to ask, any questions. And if there are currently no questions, then I might have one or two questions prepared for you, Majid. So while people correct their thoughts, maybe we can have a few discussions based on that. So I genuinely admit that your ambition is humbling to me. I am certainly not as knowledgeable as you about political philosophy, but I do see the underpinnings of what you're doing and why it is extremely valuable. So let me start by saying that this is an area of genuine philosophical and also scientific value. We need to start discussing how are we to acclimate or accommodate normative frameworks within the best descriptions we currently have of the physics of self-organizing systems like this. So that is not definitely lost. Let me move the camera here. Okay. So now let me be tough a bit on you. So I want to have more of a I would say strike style question. So let's see what survives. So in the talk, I mean, I have the slides in front of me. You sort of move from the self-organizing systems that persist by minimizing VFE to justice as fairness that arises from the free energy minimizations in social systems. And then you say explicitly on a slide that, let me say, justice to the society is like the principles of self-organization homeostasis to the body. So definitely you make that analogy, which is all fine. But what I'm missing here is what is the norm generating step? What generates that normative jump that licenses the move? Because just think of it this way: you can have an apartheid state that persists, minimizes prediction error for its in-group, maintains a well-defined MB, but then if you are identifying justice with whatever stabilizes that social system by regulating uncertainty, then that to me seems that it's not much difference from mere persistence, like the system just persists. Is justice something on top of that sheer persistence, which is mandated by or which is underwritten by regulating uncertainty at the system level? So, and if not, then if justice is not just that, what is that extra normative premise that I hope does not violate your radically naturalist derivation? So yeah, that's that's a tough one, but please help me understand better.
All right, that's excellent. Thank you very much for bringing that up. So, first of all, to be quite clear, I do not think that justice is anything above and beyond minimizing free energy. So I think that sophisticated form of minimizing free energy. I think that justice is only that. That said, I would say that, so you said that I mentioned cells, and then I jumped to theory of justice. Yeah, and this is completely true. But I would say that there were also two, I mean, the main thing were actually the two other steps that were included. So first of all, it is not only about selfhood. So free energy principle underwrites on an account of selfhood. That's completely true, and I mentioned that. But I also mentioned two other things. Free energy principle also, I think that provides an account of social collaboration and social cooperation. So it is not only about individual cells, but also about group of organisms, how they minimize their collective free energy. So, but I don't think that you have any problem with that too. So it is not also missed on you, because you said that in groups, they may just minimize free energy for their in-group and so on. So first cells, then social groups and so on. But there was another step, and that was, as it happens, is a step that you should be very good at technically and philosophy, and it is the multi-scale nature of free energy minimization, and that's very important. You see, so it only doesn't apply to selves. I mean, it also applies to groups, but not only to groups, but to the societies, but not only to the societies, but to the collection of all of the societies. So, do you remember that I said that in the downward path? It starts from Rawls' theory of justice, his theory of justice as fairness and so on. And this is the criticism that you mentioned is precisely one of the criticisms that Amartya Sen launches against Rawls' original theory of justice.
Yeah.
That's all right. You have justice as fairness for a specific group. It may work for a specific group of agents, but it doesn't mean that it can also apply to other group of agents. So what's the measure for globalizing that? And it is also a part of my project to show that this problem could be solved precisely by using active inference across a scale. So you couldn't, in other words, you couldn't have justice per se in the sense of sophisticated active inference, sophisticated free energy minimization, so far as you only consider minimization of free energy for a group of agents. But when you can globalize that across all the groups that you have, right? So philosophically, we can just discuss that in very abstract terms. But when we are using active inference, we actually have a tool for being able to model that and measure that. So the relation between these specific groups, the entropy, so because it comes in terms of nested Markov blankets, Markov blankets at different levels of generality. And so eventually you would have at the top of your hierarchy, you would have at the up of your system, you would have a specific generated model that is the source of your justice. So it is supposed to be originated from there. And there is always, of course, interaction between what's coming from upward coming and downward coming and so on. But it doesn't apply to a specific group. In other words, if you look at human society, human community as a general org, you can see all of that as something that has to keep its general entropy within boundaries, right? And actually, it is the only way to regulate justice in the world, because so far as you are going to do that locally in this group and that group, they can locally regulate their entropy, but it doesn't guarantee the persistence of the old system as the system of human beings. See? So it only works, justice in the sense that I'm defending in terms of sophisticated active inference minimization. It only applies if you apply that globally to the whole society of human beings, and then you could define measures and parameters of how in a specific groups it could be defined in terms of the relation between individual agents and their group, and then also in the level of all society in terms of the balance between entropy of each one of these specific groups and the entropy of all system. And it is the only way that you can have justice. So one of the projects that I'm thinking of under this general project comes in terms of globalizing Rawls' theory of justice.
Okay, fair enough. Then I would have one minor finger on that, just to be sure I understand what you say. That overarching model that generates your justice, where at what scale do we specify that model? What would its recognition density would look like, even in technical terms? Because what you say that by this globalizing move, I am concerned that the moment your sort of reactor of justice is a generative model of the totality of our species as a social species that inevitably constructs institutions, states, individual to individual mappings, and all things like that begin to be decomposed in this overarching mothership model. And that's where they sort of trickle down justice from that model, if you want. My concern is that you cannot coherently probably even formulate that model, because what would that model entail? The totality of all the people existing now? The totality of the all the people that just died right now? Like, how many people have just died in this second?
Fair enough. That's a very good point too. And I'm going to walk on very thin ice now because I'm not a statistician. But one other thing that triggered my approach, and I'm going to, as I say, start to in terms that shouldn't be probably used by philosophers. But von Neumann-Morgenstern concept of expected utility. I mean, it would be very difficult to use that for modeling this kind of global and dynamic concept of justice, precisely because what it lacks is this kind of dynamism to capture the interact. Yeah, what it is von Neumann, Morgenstern. Yeah. So, and I hope that, I mean, it is my hope that using active inference in this context provide a handle or foothold for being able to represent the dynamics of justice. I mean, not only so. In other words, I'm thinking of that not in terms of a static decision problem, but a dynamic of decision problem. So it is, as I say, it's as you say, it generates and overflows from the uh, topmost generative model, but at the same time, it all the time receives feedback from the lower step. And at each scale, at level, there is an interaction between a downward coming stream and upward coming stream. So it is I think of that as dynamic model. And I think that this is why active inference as a regulator of theory of, this is why I think that if utilitarianism adopts active inference, it would end up with much better dynamic than just adopting measures like von Neumann-Morgenstern. I expect that if well, Carl, who basically is omniscience, or if some statistician is here, might tell me that what I'm talking total nonsense here. But at least I think that it could be represented in rather sound statistical terms. In terms
Okay.
of advantage of active inference, dynamics of active inference over just von Neumann Morgenstern concept of expected utility.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, definitely would be probably more expressive power in that formulation. So yeah, let's thank you so much for your answer, Majid, and
Thank you very much for your question.
let's give the floor to Alexander Kearney. Alexander.
Hey, thank you. So first thing I wanted to say is that I think that kind of framing the like laws and institutions as the sort of self of a society and maybe the generative model is a really interesting perspective. And thank you for your talk generally. And I think that there's many ways we can kind of extend that. For example, maybe like regulation or updating a law could be seen as updating the generative model. Maybe culture could be part of the generative model too. I think kind of the points I have are, I've sort of got an overarching question of, it seems to me that different societies have different generative models. And I think that if we're kind of choosing the most dominant one, we would look kind of at what has happened in practice, you know, which society is the most powerful currently, or which one is the sort of longest lasting. And I think with regards to sort of modeling globally, I'm not sure if people would be the natural kind of unit of measure, maybe countries or trading blocks or something like that would. So my question is kind of what you think of those sort of points, I guess, intended completely constructively.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, I'm very happy that you see some opportunities for improvements there. And so the first point would be kind of marketing. So when I first spoke about this project to Carl, and he was very accommodating and kind as he usually is. I also said that it will be a big project. I'm a philosopher. I'm not sure that I will be able to expand all of these aspects single-handedly, even though I try. But so far it has been one person's crusade. So if anyone thinks that this project has something interesting in that, so bandwagon is here. Don't hesitate to jump on. I mean, I'm looking forward to more people to join and develop a new version of utilitarianism. But the other point that you said, basically, this is one of the main motives of developing this project. So Rawls' theory of justice has been criticized constantly. So I'm going to repeat a part of what I have just said to Robert, but I'm going to elaborate about a bit more about that in answer to your question. So basically, one of the main motives was that Rawls' theory has been considered to be too partial, too limited about only a specific society, and how could you achieve free energy principle? Sorry, how to achieve some sort of justice and fairness in that. But well, priors are different in different societies. Generative models are different in different societies. The point is very well taken. So, and I'm all for acknowledging this kind of pluralism and diversity, right? But assuming that all of these societies are living in the same world, and despite all of this diversity, there should be some parameters that is common between them. So there should be also some commonality between this kind of societies. In other words, there should be also some sort of more general, higher level generative model that could be invoked to regulate some basics of different ways and manners that different societies have to implement their norms of justice, right? So in other words, we want to respect the diversity of different norms of justice in different societies, but to what extent you would be ready to accept this diversity? I mean, in other words, are we going to be completely on board with all kinds of diversity in different kinds of societies? Or we think that the diversity should be acknowledged to a specific extent, but there should be also constraint on when this diversity leads to obvious violation of some form of justice that should be universal to human beings. You see, and I basically see active inference as a tool for balancing this. So on the one hand, you have these norms of justice that are specific to specific groups and they should be respected. On the other hand, you have some sort of universal norms of justice that presumably apply to all societies. We don't want to throw out all of this diversity completely, but we want to give up on, I don't know, I think that you have been present from the start when I was speaking about Thomas Hobbes' model of society and social order. So, and I said that on the one end of the extreme is extreme complexity, where each individual is pursuing their own goals. And on the other extreme is some sort of absolute monarchy, which just one person is imposing its will to all society, their will to all society. And I think that it also applies to a free energy principle can be used to strike some sort of balance between this extreme complexity and that extreme accuracy. And I think that this also applies to norms of justice in different societies. So in different societies, extreme diversity of norms of justice in different societies potentially could lead to extreme complexity when sometimes norms of justice in a specific societies could be things that sound to be unfair by any standard. On the other hand, there is just universal conception of justice that could overrule or just distort what's valuable in these diverse societies. And I think that active inference and free energy principle could be used to strike a balance between this extreme diversity and that extreme universal idea. And I start to speak in very general terms, in terms that may sound unfalsifiable, which could be blamed to some extent, I think, to invoking active inference in general. But I think that it could be developed. I mean, if enough effort be put to that, I think that it could be led to specific examples with concrete outcomes. Say, in case of, for example, political system, political regimes, issues of climate change. I think that at least I can think of a couple of examples, such as climate change and political regime across different societies with different norms of justice. Does it make any sense to you, what I'm trying to say?
I think there's some very interesting stuff there. So there is some interesting content in just complexity theory more broadly. I think the Santa Fe Institute might have some resources on this, and it talks about exactly what you said about kind of tyranny versus complete lack of structure, and kind of how the complexity of an individual decision maker constrains the complexity of the system in tyranny. However, in like the opposite of tyranny, it also does, because you know, things can't combine together to create something greater from the whole. With regards to different societies, I guess, like, and this is purely just to sort of challenge you or ask you if you've thought about this perspective. I think the key thing I would sort of say is that the different societies which exist are operating non-independently. So I think a good analogy that I think about a lot, because I'm, you know, a lot of my work focuses on the brain and stuff like that, is that if you look at the human body, right, you've got skin cells, you've got brain cells, you've got heart cells, you've got muscle cells. They're all minimizing free energy, you know, assuming FEP is correct, that they're all minimizing free energy in their own way. And then they combine together, and the free energy of the whole is minimized as well. But that doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, the same rules or the same priors. There might be some, you know, very basic. I mean, obviously there is some very basic common stuff. You know, all cells come from stem cells, right? But I think sometimes almost sort of taking the view above and looking at it as a, you know, nested Markov blankets, just from a mathematical perspective, is often how I would prefer to think of it. And I guess in applying to that with the world and different societies, we've got a particular configuration that exists. It's not the only configuration that could exist, right? You know, bananas are configurations of cells, or you know, banana trees. So are chimpanzees, and so are humans. And if we look at the animal kingdom, or even the plant kingdom, there are configurations of organisms which tend to develop, which are different to how humans configure. But yeah, like, I guess kind of in the interest of understanding the one that we have as it is, I guess where my mind might go would be sort of, I don't know, you probably want to look at how, you know, the United States and the UK and Europe and, you know, trying to think of other countries, but my mind's slightly blank. You probably want to think about how they're all, other territories. You probably want to think about how they're all interacting together and sort of simultaneously minimizing their own free energy, plus also combining into something bigger, which is minimizing its own free energy. And that's just a sort of challenge I'll put. I guess kind of the key question I would have, which I think acts as a broader question above my more specific questions, is kind of, how committed are you to the Rawlsian view? Like, would you be open to maybe, let's say, developing a strictly functionalist perspective on law and regulation and how it exists today?
Yeah, very well.
Something pluralistic, or maybe something very open-ended, like you're sort of investigating how different laws model. And final thing I'll throw in here as a statistical point is just with surprisal of the individual versus surprisal of the whole. I personally would want to think very carefully about how surprisal of the whole is modeled. For example, maybe it's not actually about individual surprisal or adding up all of the individual surprisal. Maybe it's kind of some sort of unexpected event, like a I don't know, like a revolution, or like a public scandal, or the leader of the society getting displaced prematurely. You know, modeling these events in strictly probabilistic terms with respect to the generative model, I might like my mind might sort of go there rather than translating it to survival of individuals. This is just my perspective. Obviously, I've heard 40 minutes of your work. I'm just curious about what you think about all of these things.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. So, is my microphone on? Yeah, it is. So, thank you very much. Starting from your last point, so the surprise of the group is not necessarily the aggregate of surprise of the individual. I'm completely on board with that. And the best account that I read about that, as I say, is Preston and Fries's account, A Duet for One, in which they explain in detail how the minimization of free energy of a shared generative model. So I think that if memory serves, they use the example of bird song. So when they are two birds are trying to coordinate their song from the same hymn sheet. So when they are doing that, the minimization of collective entropy doesn't necessarily take place in terms of minimization of entropy of each individual. In other words, the minimization of entropy of each individual is more costly than just using a shared generative model that enables them to, and in the context of this theory, political thought, what I'm trying to understand is that what would be that shared generative model that could be used to coordinate the actions and decisions of a specific groups of people or societies. You see? And then these groups and society to have their own shared generative model that shapes the action. So I completely agree with the last points that you made. Also about some studies that is made in Santa Fe Institute. I'm familiar with some of them. And actually, the first study that I found this context, a statistical a study, comes from also a philosopher who was, I mean, a jack of all trades, master of all, Patrick Colonel Supes. And I think that in 1950s, I think, I'm not sure about the year, but he wrote a couple of papers to try to define the measure of liberty, and he defined the measure of liberty in terms of entropy and so on, and used the example of some outcomes of voting in the United States and so on. And it was interesting, but the context was very limited because I think that it was focusing on voting in some specific states in United States, and also the measure that he was using was just entropy. So, and I think that active inference provides better dynamics than just entropy. I have to certainly look into some specific experimental studies and studies from political sciences and so on. But my interest in Rawls theory, and I'm certainly willing to go beyond Rawls at some stage. I mean, I'm willing to develop a new version of utilitarianism. So as I said, my long-term goal is to go and develop a new version of utilitarianism that is sensitive to social issues as well. So it is also fair. So I'm not that much committed to Rawls, but yeah. Why I started to think of this in terms of Rawls, because I think that Rawls also thinks of justice in terms of specific principles. This is not something that is very common in political theorists and so on, to have a specific principles. It is at the same time something daring and very risky, and I think that it is why it is interesting. You set your principles there, and of course then they will be open to specific objections, as Rawls' principles have been. But I think that so far as we are in the business of trying to find a specific principle for justice, and we have tried, I mean, by saying that I'm using we collectively, including myself into the cohort of Carl Friston, we have been trying to find this principle for self-regulation of entities that are as sophisticated as selves and agents, right? And I think that it will be a step. I think that it wouldn't be too unlikely a step to try to extend that also to questions of social justice and so on. So, but I'm looking at that basically in terms of first principle at the moment. So there are many diversities, there are many parameters and priors and elements that could be different in different contexts. So, what was the name of one of Mike Levin's paper that I think that it was a sentence taken from Charles Darwin's book. I think endless
Endless,
forms,
endless,
endless
and
forms,
endless,
most beautiful.
most
So
beautiful.
there
Yeah,
is
yeah.
this diversity and there is this beauty, and they are evolving in different ways. I mean, this kind of different creatures in the world and different systems and so. But what is their main underlying principle that enables this diversity? See, so as a philosopher of science, I mean, I was interested in finding, specifying this unifying principle. And it is how I ended up studying free energy principle and so. So I completely agree with everything that you said. But at the same time, I think that it would be wonderful if we can specify some specific principle and set them out as something that could be used to regulate issues of justice, not only in specific nations, not only in specific societies, but in specific societies, but also across different societies at a global scale. And I think that active inference has a very fair chance of doing so. And there are theories of justice out there, right, like Rawls' theory of justice, that also try to think of to specify justice in terms of principle. And this is why I brought up John Rawls' theory. But at some stage, I mean, when I'm perhaps more self-confident or more knowledgeable about these issues, because I'm not also a political philosopher, I would certainly aim for going beyond Rawls and trying to develop new versions of utilitarianism that are more goals.
Would you say that your goal is sort of normative or descriptive? Because I guess one counter argument I could envisage would be that the free energy principle, assuming its veracity, is inevitable, and therefore, however humanity ends up, you know, even if it's complete annihilation, is ultimately a minimization of free energy, right? Like people, like someone could say that the free energy principle is just a law, it's inevitable. So I guess, do you kind of see it as we need to set up the correct systems to enable kind of sustainable self-organization? Or would you see it more as self-organization, or at least FEP is inevitable?
Oh, fair enough.
We're going to do what we're going to do.
No, fair enough. I mean, this is why yeah, once upon a time, I mean, 8 years ago, I get a job as an instructor of ethics, and I started to teach ethics. And immediately, as soon as I saw utilitarianism, I get attracted to that because I have been a hardcore naturalist. I think that there is no wedge between descriptive and normative. My ideas in this are congenial to ideas of David Hume, for example. Ethics, social order, and so on are basically developed to underwrite the stability of a group of people or a society. But I'm also supporting utilitarianism because ethical issues there are, yeah, ethical issues are discussed not in terms of purely normative terms, in terms of transcendental normative terms that are, I mean, detached from the goings on in the world of nature, in the natural world, but something that should be completely inherent into the natural world. So I consider human beings as natural entities, and I think that all aspects of their life has something natural into them, and it would be best if we could also try to explain theories of, if at a level of meta-ethics, we could produce theories that build on what is already unearthed by natural scientists. And in this, I'm in complete agreement with ethicists like Peter Singer and others who are, and Joshua Green and so on. So I would say that I'm supporting utilitarianism and naturalism unabashedly. And I'm aware that if I'm going with that into a commodity of Kantian ethicists or other kind of philosopher, I'm sure that I have to come with far more sophisticated arguments for my stance. And I'm quite sure that even after that, they would just look down at me as someone who is just too impressed by cleverness of scientists. But this is who I am. Sorry, I mean, it came with harsher rhetoric than than I intended to give to you. But your point is well taken. I have to think about that more. But I'm a nationalist. This is what I'm trying to say.
Oh yeah, no, I think that was very interesting. Thank you. And that was going to be my last question. I'm going to ask one more tiny one, which is, do you feel like the natural laws coincide with, justice in the way that we typically understand it? Some of the sort of longest, almost persistently repeating systems in human history, haven't necessarily met the standard definition of justice. They might entail corruption, unjust suppression of some kind.
Yeah, fair enough.
Do you think that kind of the naturalists? Yeah, I guess that.
Yeah. I'm going to do a bit of also self-advertisement here, but the point is, I'm afraid that I'm going to give a long answer to that. So, I mean, this is I have been working in terms of on theories of selfhood, on agency, but more than that, I'm a philosopher of science. So, for most of my career, I have been discussing laws of nature and laws of physics and other kinds of things. So, and there are two groups, I mean, there are different groups of philosophers when discussing laws of nature and so on. And I'm a naturalist. At the same time, I'm a humanist in the sense that, and this is something that I discussed expansively in my last book with Routledge, in 2024 book with and it comes very smugly and snobbishly, but it is not only because of, self-advertisement, but because there I developed theories of laws of nature and causality, and there I argue that these things, laws of nature and causality, are not objective entities that exist out there in a human independent world, but but laws of nature and causal laws and so on are things that are projected by human beings onto the world. You see, and I consider that to be quite natural. So I'm completely for the dominance of sciences, and I'm ready to take the literal truths of scientific theories and so on. But at the same time, I think that laws of nature, the physical world. So in other words, let's say that there is a division of opinion in philosophy of science. There's the first group of philosophers of science who think that physics is the dominant science and everything, laws of nature, causality, and so on, everything else is specified in terms of physics, and we are going to discover them there. Laws of nature are specified by physics, and then we are going to extract them. And then if you want to explain the relation of laws of physics to theories of justice, for example, you have to try very hard because the physical thing with human mating are different things. So this was the first group of philosophers of science, the division of opinion. The second group of philosophers of science consists in me. I do not think that laws of nature are out there in the physical world. I think that the science that is in question here is not science of physics alone, but a unified concept of science that includes also neuroscience, cognitive science, biology, and physics. And then I think that our conception of laws of nature projected by human being onto the world and is supposed to build bridges between these different scientific domains, cognitive science, biology, and physics, and so on. And I think that to some extent, this notion that we have from fundamental laws of physics is basically projected by our own understanding of the world onto the physical world. And I think that from this perspective, because it is all, when I said that the second group is only consists of me, I was joking. So there are also far more sophisticated philosophers, such as Hugh Price and Nancy Cartwright, who are also defending this view. So, but they are not, I mean, unpacking all of its consequences as much as I do. So, but it is far easier to try to make bridges between laws of nature from the second perspective, in which laws of nature also are projected from a humanistic perspective. It is far easier to build bridges between laws of nature in the physical world and laws of nature that are supposed to govern the behavior of human entities and agents. Sorry. Sorry.
No, thank you.
No, I thank you. It was very stimulating and very nice set of questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alexander, for these prompts. Very good. We're moving forward. Are there any other questions from the audience? If not, maybe one final quick stress test, Majid. You up for it?
I mean, do you mean that you want to ask a question? Please go on if you. Thank you.
Indeed. So it's somewhat a version, or at least a strand that could be unpacked from my initial question, together with some of the threads that Alexander pursued. But let's focus on the reflective equilibrium part, which you model as the complexity accuracy decomposition of VFE. Now, what you say it's measurable and objective. That's one thing. And then when you specify the P of S in that model, you say that it encodes prior commitments like candidate principles of justice and background moral assumptions. So the question here is, what is objective, genuinely objective? Is it the math? This is the formal structure of basically the way you do the VFE calculus? Is that the objective part here? Is it the moral inputs or whatever are those things that go into the prior commitments? Are those objectives? Because the complexity accuracy trade-off, assuming the other principles of other assumptions of FEP holds, is just a universal identity. So you would have both unjust and just equilibria that satisfy that decomposition of complexity and accuracy. So a caste system and a participative democracy are both reflective, are both at equilibrium, so they have both achieved steady state, some form of steady state specific to the FEP. But that does not mean, obviously, and I get it that you wouldn't say that both are at reflective equilibrium, Rawlsianly speaking. So how are we to navigate that?
Yeah, very good. So it is again one of the main original objections to reflective equilibrium, because it has been said that it only aims for coherence. So you can give it any principle. And as it happens, do you remember that I mentioned Nelson Goodman? It is also an objection that applies to Nelson Goodman's theory of justification of induction that only aims for coherence. All right. So what changes when we bring active inference to the scene? So I think that the main difference is precisely what you mentioned about how you assign your priors, right? And it has been eternally a problem for Bayesians of different strands how to assign their priors without being involved into subjectivism. Yeah. And I think that again, this is something that a free energy principle can be very helpful with, because when you are using free energy principle, you do not need to assign credence or priors just subjectively, right? Because so again, I think that's possibly because I'm too illiterate to go to more advanced stuff. The best statement of this that I know comes actually from Carl's classical 2010 paper, Free Energy Principle, a Unified Brain. So the priors free energy principle does in there, you don't need to assign your priors. You don't need to assign them subjectively, because there is a dynamical interaction between priors. So you have priors, and then you receive feedbacks constantly, and the priors could be updated and updated until the system receives some sort of balance. So again, I may understand that it may raise many a philosopher's eyebrow in doubt the way that I'm using that, but I think that this is precisely the advantage of using free energy principle, as opposed to just using Bayesianism or a theory that aims for coherence or mathematical interpretation of entropy or information theory, that you don't need to assign your priors In other words, in Rawlsian terms, you don't need to choose your principles subjectively. You set some principles there, but you have to be open to revising them in terms of the update, feedback that you receive from the lower parts of your hierarchy. And the priors could be updated and updated and updated again. And when the system is achieving the state of balance, you could be sure that, I mean, you can think that you achieve some sort of objectivity in the system. And it is in this sense that I'm using objectivity as opposed to subjective assignment of priors or subjective selection of principles. Does it make sense
Indeed,
to
but
you?
it definitely makes sense, but the iterative message passing that goes and you keep computing the FEP at different steps in the system, that does not, the fact that that happens and you have this iteration where you modify the priors at every step in virtue of what comes next and you keep using the
Yes.
machinery, that does not guarantee. So I'm not attacking you on the objectivity of the
I
priors.
understand.
I'm attacking you on the fact that you have, in whatever way you want to decline the objectivity talk, objective priors, that does not move you from that claim to the conclusion that what you end up with is a just or reflective equilibrium. You might end up on any equilibrium that is respecting the equations of the FEP, but that would not be just, because you need something more for that.
Fair enough. I hear you completely. Look, I completely agree. But I would say that it is only if you have some sort of transcendental notion of justice in mind. You see, when we were trying to justify induction by provoking active inference, the most the strongest criticism that we were receiving by referees and people and so on was that, all right, it doesn't guarantee the truth of your conclusion. I mean, you can always say that I achieved something reliable, but the collaborator, I mean, as it happens, I mean, the collaborator of the papers on induction has been also the president of Charles Sanders Peirce Society. So what I'm trying to say that it comes with very strong pragmatist connotations. In other words, truth is not some sort of transcendental, strong, abstract concept, but only what you achieve at the end of inquiry. So truth is whatever that you achieve in the end of inquiry, and justice is whatever that if you are very smart with that, if you regulate your system very good, not only locally but globally and so on. Justice is what would become predominant in your society when every part of the society is achieving a state of relative balance.
All right, let's leave it here. I genuinely understand what you're saying. I did my PhD on Kant, so I know a thing or two about taking the transcendental stance. And I was not taking that. I was trying to derive some way of getting the reflective equilibrium rather than just equilibrium, sans phrase, like just simple equilibrium. But for sure,
and I was very naive when I came here. I mean, as a philosopher, I mean, I was just worried of revealing my ignorance of the formal stuff and work on the statistical stuff and so on. So I really didn't expect to be grilled by philosophers. I mean, by this kind of advanced philosophical questions. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Majid, for giving us the grilling opportunity. And now, given that our grilling probably has come to an end, from the audience at least, I suspect it's Carl's turn now.
Is it my turn now?
It seems so, Carl, though this time I'm particularly keen on seeing you summarize this. I'm curious how your working memory will face up to this task.
Yeah, I can do that. I think he's being ironic. Yeah. So,
before you start, Carl, should I hide behind the table? I mean, I'm so worried about the mistakes that I might have been making.
Oh, no, not at all. No. I was just about to apologize for not being able to give you a philosophical grilling, having no philosophical training myself. But I actually was impressed by the way that you very clearly say this is how a philosopher sees the math, which is not necessarily how a physicist would. No, I thought you pitched that exactly right, and if you want my honest opinion, I think that the arguments you brought to the table, those that I understood, and also your response to the grilling and the stress testing, were exactly right from the perspective of the physics. So that's my perspective, and that's why I'm apologising. You're not going to get a philosophical grilling, but I will just pick up on the themes that I remember. Through the lens of the natural sciences, and I don't want to commit to physics here. I'm talking. I notice you're using the word naturalist a lot. I think what you're talking about are the laws of natural science and laws of nature that are not necessarily special cases of which would be quantum physics or quantum mechanics or statistical mechanics or indeed Bayesian mechanics. I'm talking about sort of the more transcendental, perhaps I'm using that in an awfully wrong way, but the principles of least action upon which the free energy principle is based. There's what was teasing me. Can I summarize it? Because it's a job to remember all the themes that you've covered. But just in reverse order, before I forget, that last question that you were pressed upon, I understood as asking, well, what is the difference between any equilibrium, steady state, to which things self-organize, and a reflexive equilibrium that is characterized by some notion, underlying principle of justice? I think the answer you gave could be paraphrased by appealing to one of your earlier responses, and it would be along the following lines. So again, this is from a purely a natural science perspective, that neither the RE nor the equilibria in physics are apt descriptions of any self-organization that applies to systems that are embedded in a larger context, namely they are open systems. And therefore what we're actually talking about are non-equilibria steady states. So that's the first mistake made by the Rawls, calling it an equilibrium. It's not an equilibrium, it's a non-equilibrium. But it has a steady state. It has characteristic states, some of which are extremely unlikely to be occupied, and those are basically the very surprising states that are precluded by that minimax principle. Because if you're in that state, you wouldn't be the kind of system that you are. You wouldn't be the kind of society, or indeed an individual within that society, that you are. So I think that's relevant to express like that. Because what you can then say, all right, what we are looking for is a 21st century rationalism, you call it utilitarianism. So the first thing you need is a utilitarianism of open systems. So by definition, open systems cannot have an equilibrium, but they can have a non-equilibrium steady state. What does it mean to be open? Well, it means that you are exposed, you are standing in some relation to another system. So that immediately says that what you want, if you want a sort of 21st century version of Rawls, is a relational non-equilibrium. So forget about the reflective. You're just talking about the relationship of self to non-self, to which you are open, which means that you can now talk about relational equilibria, but noting it's a non-equilibrium steady state. And that's nice because you can start to sort of shake hands and nod to other relational natural sciences such as relativity in classical mechanics, or non-relativistic mechanics. You talk about relational quantum mechanics, which is, to my mind, one of the best ways of understanding many of the puzzles in quantum mechanics. And it also has the same acronym. So if you can associate an RE with a relational non-equilibrium steady state, that immediately says, well, you're relating something to something else. How do you separate them? And then you say, well, the FEP does this with the Markov blanket. That's the whole point of defining the self in self-organization. So I think there's a nice isomorphism between the notion of a relational or a reflective non-equilibrium steady state, or NESS, and exactly the explanatory target of the free energy principle. It's just about describing the dynamics and the relational aspects of any system that is open to the rest of the world. You can then generalize that argument to the scale-free argument. I think your scale-free argument was, scale-invariant argument was absolutely crucial. And that can bring us back to the very first stress test of the arguments, which is, well, what about autocracies? What about sort of echo chambers and in-groups that persist simply because they defend themselves against any perturbation or external disruption? I thought that was an interesting, and your response was exactly, no, you can't have that. You can't have a closed system, because we are, by definition, talking about cells, selves, people, populations, institutions, territories that are always embedded in a larger context and are open to that larger context at every scale. Which means that if you imagine the existence of some autocracy of a fundamentally isolationist sort that cuts off all interactions with the rest of the universe, you are now talking about a system that is closed. So from the physicist's perspective, that system will actually attain an equilibrium. And that equilibrium would be basically the system being dead. That would be the sort of minimum free energy solution. That can't occur in the real universe because there are no closed systems in the real universe. In the real universe, everything is open and therefore has this scale-free aspect. The, the reason I'm phrasing it like that is that there is, I think, an amusing link from Robert's question to something that Mike Levin often muses about, and I do as well. So, what is an example of an isolationist autocracy in biology? What kind of self-organization would render you insensitive and isolated from the local cellular or physiological niche in which you find yourself, that persists for a certain amount of time, but ultimately destroys itself? The answer is cancer. So cancer is simply the pathology of not being able to relate to the tissue or the organ or the place in which you find yourself, a failure of the good regulator theorem. You are failing now on the inside to model what's on the outside. And you could say that cancer is, and isolationist autocracies persist. But the problem is they don't persist for very long because they kill the host. So, this is another way of looking at the importance of this scale-free. Mathematically, I think you're fully justified in referring to the renormalization group here, because the renormalization group provides you with a mechanics or a calculus that allows you to say what is conserved as you go from one scale to the next scale. And that conservation clearly is not the principles or the prior preferences at any given scale. It is just the dynamics that is conserved from scale to scale. Those dynamics apply to all sorts of different things at any one scale. They can apply to the bacteria in my gut, they can apply to the cells in my brain, and very often, almost universally, there has to be a plurality of different systems in the ecosystem in order for it to self-organize to a non-equilibrium steady state. But what can be conserved is the dynamics, the mechanics that cause that self-organization in the context of open systems. What that means is, from the point of view of the free energy principle, the only thing that is conserved as you move up scales is the writing of self-organization in terms of a minimization of variational free energy. Why is that important? Well, it's important because the free energy is a functional of beliefs, posterior beliefs under a generative model. So immediately you bring to the table, unlike the sort of free energy in physics or thermodynamic free energies, you have now a thing that is conserved from one scale to the next scale that rests upon the notion of a generative model. And I think that's important because a number of times you talked about a shared generative model. And I think that the reflexive part, which I would just call the relational aspect of self-organization and indeed belief updating under the free energy principle, rests upon the alignment of the generative models, the shared generative models. I think that was a central theme, both in the presentation and also in your response to some of those answers. And that allows me just to ask you a question. You use the word coherence a lot, and I've heard that. I get several times a day now. I get unsolicited papers from independent researchers about their theory of everything. They invariably include the mathematical symbol phi, a reference to the free energy principle, and invariably the word coherence. And I'm just wondering where coherence comes from, because it's certainly not something that I've ever written about. Coherence is a very specific and technical and narrow meaning in terms of signal processing. And when you were talking about the duet for one, that was always articulated in terms of something called generalized synchrony or synchrony of chaos. So can I just ask you, what have you seen this emergence of the word coherence, or is it a big thing in philosophy? What does it mean?
Yeah, it's a big thing in philosophy. I mean, there are theories of epistemology and truth that claim that the main thing about truth and knowledge is coherence as opposed to correspondence to reality. So it is just coherence between different pieces of. And I was using coherence here in a pejorative way. I mean, people when trying to criticize John Rawls' theory of justice, reflective equilibrium, and so on, they were mainly criticizing that on the basis of that it only aims for coherence, and coherence could be achieved in a number of different ways. So it is not enough for grounding a theory of justice, for supporting a theory of justice. And what I was trying to show here was that by using free energy principle active inference, because its close relation with facts of life and facts of nature, we can go just beyond a loose notion of coherence and actually state that a state theory of justice in more objective terms, in the sense that I described to Robert, not in any philosophically strong sense of objective, but in terms of something that goes beyond subjectively imagined coherence between different parts of theory. So it is the way that philosophers are using that. I'm not aware of the technical use in formalism and so on.
Oh, well, that's very. I didn't know that. That was very useful. I mean, I think you could license the use of that mathematically in the following sense that the free energy minimizing solution for any, say, dyadic interaction between two societies or two people or two songbirds, as you alluded to, is certainly can be expressed as a generalized synchrony, convergence and a synchronization manifold. But there is a notion in which they are also coherent. I should say, open brackets, I wondered whether it came from quantum theory and decoherence, but it doesn't. It's clearly a sort of a philosophical notion, close brackets. But another way of reading that joint free energy minimizing solution is a maximization of the mutual information. And a maximization of the mutual information could certainly be read as some kind of coherence, which has no truth pointing aspect to it. It's just that there is a synchrony and a high mutual information. So interestingly, the average of the expected free energy over all things that you could engage with the sensorium literally just is the mutual information minus your expected cost, which is the negative utility that you were talking about. Um, um, so you could sort of argue that there is coherence for free, which is not truth pointing in any sense. And just to sort of open that up, that part of the argument up. Um, you know, inference to the best explanation under the Bayesian mechanics of the free energy principle um, has no truth pointing. There is no truth because the best explanation is the one that has the right balance between the complexity and the accuracy. Which means that even if you generated some data for me and you knew the truth of how that data was generated, and I tried to infer the best explanation for those data in terms of its causes, I will always find a better explanation than the way that you generated it. And that's because I can always find a simpler way of generating the same data. And therefore, for the same accuracy, I can find a smaller complexity, and therefore the marginal likelihood or the model evidence for my explanation is greater than the explanation that you use to generate your data. So if you associate truth with some magical person generating data, the experimenter who knows how the data were generated, the best explanation for that data has got nothing to do with the truth. It's the simplest explanation for those data. So there is absolutely no truth pointing in any sort of probabilistic notion of inference to the best explanation. I've always read it, sort of inductive logic as basically being the sort of the Bayesian equivalent of deductive and abductive. Oh no, I haven't. It's abductive logic. So yeah, the closest to sort of Bayesian mechanics. But I just wanted to say that in my world, truth pointing is a distraction. So if you get anybody concerned about truth pointing, they are a distraction. Probably not worth talking to them. You move on to something more interesting because simply because the most likely the model or the hypothesis of explanation for anything that is not directly observed is by definition the simplest explanation, and that's the only unique explanation, and that relates very, very closely to James's maximum entropy principle. So you're saying for you're doing the philosophy of science, so there's a dualism, or you can look at with certain qualifications, you can look at James's maximum entropy principle as a theory of measurement in physics or observation in physics as dual to the free energy principle. And the maximization of the entropy is basically the entropy that we're talking about is the entropy of the inference of the measurement. So you always try to keep your options open by minimizing the complexity in compliance with Occam's razor. And in so doing, there is no notion of truth anymore. It's just getting the right balance between the two. And that, yeah. Can I grab the screen and just show you a couple of papers that may or may not be useful, most of which you've referenced already. But I was taken by this notion of finding your ambition and your modesty suggests that you're likely to fail in it. But your ambition to find a 21st century utilitarianism that foregrounds the inadequacy of von Neumann, Morgenstern. Who were the people you associated with expected utility?
Yeah, von Neumann. I mean, there was, as you remarked, there was von Neumann Morgenstern, but there was also a name that I possibly mispronounced. Harshani, John Harshani or Harzani. I mean, who was, I mean, a critic of theories of John Rawls and was arguing that this Rawlsian approach to maximin is incompatible with the utilitarian conception of expected utility as is stated by von Neumann and Morgenstern.
Right. Yeah. So I think that
And
was another recurrent theme that was in your presentation, which which I understood and certainly can fully endorse.
oh, all
Um,
right, well, because this Harshani thing, it seems that he is right now an important figure in utilitarianism and different sorts of decision theory that are related to theories of ethics and economics, and people are trying to defend his wisdom in criticizing. So it is a big thing again, this Harshani in a specific literature, in certain literature, and I'm very
right.
pessimistic.
Yeah. Forgive my arrogance, but much of these discussions occur in the context of either behavioral psychology or economics.
Economics,
This is
yes.
this is not proper maths. It's not proper physics. So if you want, let me show you what I mean in terms of a slide that I often I'm hoping that you can see. So this is a slide which I often show
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
during, which you'll be familiar with. So we're
yeah, of
talking
course.
about this thing here. Um, the the point being made here that in the more in the larger scheme of things, from the first principles account afforded by things like the free energy principle and its applications to quantum mechanics, classical mechanics, and statistical mechanics, and Bayesian mechanics, then your expected utility theory is there but it's just one small facet of the underlying imperatives for self-organization, or the way things are. I should say that the free energy principle would actually do one of Dan Dennett's strange inversions. It would not allow you to say that there are some principles that you could call justice that
All right, very good.
cause self-organization to a fair society. It doesn't work like that. If there is any pullback attractor or any system that has some characteristic states that have a sufficient persistence, then by definition that is a description of the characteristic states of that system. That is a fair system. That is a
Yeah,
just system,
yeah,
just like natural selection. And in the particular instance of the free energy principle, it is just a relational non-equilibrium steady state. That is justice. So justice is, if you like, an as-if emergent, or the principles that underlie the high-cost states that are very surprising, like the gentleman dying anyway of cancer if he doesn't get the prescribed drug. That's just almost a tautological description of the states that define the system in question. So on that view, all non-equilibrium steady states are REs, and they are all consistent with the principles of justice. So from that point of view, can you pick out anything which looks like which violates the von Neumann-Morgenstern utilitarian formulation? Yeah, absolutely. That's trivial to do. And it's trivial because if you step out of economics and utility theory and ask what is base optimality from an information theoretic or a probability theory point of view, then it invariably has two aspects. There's the kind of optimality that expected utility would refer to, buried in or cast in terms of Bayesian decision theory. But there's another kinds of base optimality brought to the table by Dennis Lindley, which is the principles of optimum Bayesian design. So that basically is the expected information gain. That's how do you query the world? How do you reach across the separation between you and the world in which you are immersed to solicit messages or signals or cues that will, or data that will resolve the greatest amount of uncertainty or maximize the information gain. So this is the epistemic value we're talking about. But you can express that as one of the two facets of Bayes optimality. So there's Bayesian, the principles of optimal Bayesian design and the principles of Bayesian decision theory. And basic utility theory is defined by a loss function, which is a negative utility. So if you want to be Bayes optimal, you have to have an admixture of both of those, and that's just the expected free energy. And it is that quantity which is provably the best description of any self-organizing system that has a sufficiently sort of deep or hierarchical architecture, which can always be described in terms of planning as inference. So what are the implications for utility theory? It means that utility theory is just one small part of the overall objective function that has to include the epistemic value, as you say. And interestingly, the average epistemic or value or accepted information gain just is mutual information. So it brings back to coherence again.
Oh.
But it's a constrained mutual information because it's got this cost term in it here. The reason I'm putting this slide up is just to sort of highlight that expected utility as thought of in economics is just one very narrow-minded way of looking at things. If you're a control theorist, you'd be actually looking at path-integral control or KL control, or in economics, you could lump this under sort of risk-sensitive, where your objective function is a KL divergence, which is part of the expected free energy. Or you could actually go even further and say, well, let's imagine an economics with no cost functions, and then you get back to James's maximum entropy theory. So the von Neumann Morgenstern perspective is a very myopic perspective on self-organization generically. So any conversation that you have really has to be broadened its scope to accommodate a more first principles account. The other thing, and you emphasise that in your presentation, I thought that was a very compelling thing to emphasise. There is no role for expected utility in trying to describe rational behaviour. If you want rational behaviour, it has to be rational in the sense of optimal Bayesian design as well. So it has to, and I love that example with I've only got one pill and two patients. So one example of that in this particular instance, well, let's just take that example just to unpack the point you were making, but also another fundamental point which you didn't make, which I think is going to increase the power of your argument. If I've only got one pill, what am I going to do in terms of choosing whether to give it to the patient with and without cancer? Now, let's for the moment put aside the expected cost and just think about the expected information gain. If I don't know how the outcome of giving the pill, and I am a doctor, there's actually an important epistemic value if my uncertainty is, could this pill cure cancer or not? So I know that it will cure patient A, but I have some uncertainty about whether it will cure patient B. So everything else ignored, all moral and justice imperatives and fair imperatives ignored, and all measures of quality of life outcomes, there is more epistemic value in giving it to the patient with cancer because I might learn something. If he doesn't die, then I can infer that possibly this particular pill not only cures the infection that they both have, but it may also have some augmented effect on the cancer. So, and this is a real thing, when it comes to at what point do you stop your phase 3 trials and start to license a drug? The epistemic imperatives for giving drugs sometimes vastly outweigh the pragmatic or sort of utilitarian aspects. So I feel, that pill giving example is a really useful vehicle to bring people to an understanding that, to be optimal, to be rational, it cannot be described by utility theory. There are much more important aspects or broader aspects to Bayes optimal behavior that describe self-organizing systems in the way that we're talking about them. The other opportunity it gives, though, is to say, well, look, hang on. Let's now pretend that, in fact, I know this pill does not cure cancer and I know it cures this infection and they both have an infection. So who am I going to give it to? well, then we have to work out what are the principles, my prior preferences. Now, my prior preferences could be for extending the average life of the two, maximizing the quality, the equivalent, they're called qualis, Qualy in economics and epidemiology. It's a measure of the high quality life years, and if I think that the patient will die or have a compromised quality of life if I don't treat the patient is going to give a long time, then if I used a quali objective function, or my prior preferences were expressed over maintaining a high quality of life on average over the two patients, then clearly I'm going to prefer giving the drug, the pill, to the person who's not going to die soon. But I may have another kind of preference, do not kill. So if I think that I may have another kind of preference, which is, well, you can make up whichever you want, perhaps the one that's probably the most consistent in terms of your arguments about the fact that the prior preferences are those shared beliefs that are the common ground in terms of societal organization. I may have a prior belief that I and you should act in a compassionate way. And I may also believe that making judgments about quality of care based purely upon quality of life in a non-compassionate way is something that a compassionate person would not do. That would be very surprising for me. So, to justify my actions on the basis, well, that person's going to die anyway, would be from the point of view of me, my prior preferences. It would surprise me if I did that, because that would make me into a dispassionate clinician or caregiver. So I'm going to be aversive to withholding the pill from the dying patient, because that signals that I am not that signals to me that I am acting in a way which is uncharacteristic of a compassionate doctor. So this allows you now to say, well, what have we done here? We've just created two dimensions of utility. One dimension is measured in qualis. The other dimension is measured in terms of reputation. And there's a literature in economics on reputation. So how can I now accommodate that in the grander scheme of the expected free energy or the expected cost? Well, the key thing is to notice that the S here is a very high dimensional vector. So we're not talking about cost as a single variable, as would you would find in economics. We're talking about cost as a high dimensional variable with multiple constraints in different directions. So that's not the probability of a single variable that constitutes the expected cost in under active influence. It's the probability of being somewhere in a high dimensional space. And that high dimensional space has probably well, accountably large, if not uncountably large, number of dimensions. And each one of those dimensions will have its own precision and its own measure of surprise. So I could be a person who has very precise beliefs about my reputation, or the kind of things I do that would create a particular reputation. And I may have very imprecise beliefs, prior preferences about the quality of life of my patients. In which case I am going to act in a way that makes it appear that I am a compassionate person, so therefore, attaining the right kind of reputation. And therefore I'm going to treat the person with cancer, just to prove that I'm not going to be biased by dispassionate concerns about quality of life years. I'm not going to be a bean counter. I'm a real doctor, a real person. But if I have very, very precise beliefs about the quality of life, but imprecise beliefs about reputation, the behavioral the consequences of or the behaviors that underwrite my reputation, then I'm likely to give the pill to the person that's going to survive. So both of those will have different costs associated with different places in this two-dimensional space of outcomes that consequent upon the choice I make. I think that's a fundamental observation, which is often understated, because most of the time when we talk about the physics of sentient behavior and choice behavior, we're trying to reassure people, oh no, this is just a general case of utility theory. It's just a special case of reinforcement learning, but it's not, because the general formulation has to basically accommodate a multiple constraint satisfaction problem, where the multiple constraints are all the different ways in which you could not exist as the kind of thing that you think you are. And of course, in your societal example of the kind of thing we think we are, we have our shared generative model that induces shared priors. So we have a consensus about what is a just and fair way to behave. But that is specified in a high dimensional space. And you can't capture that with economics. You have to move to a much more expressive, probabilistic the kind of world that James used to live in. So you didn't mention that, but I would encourage you to mention that. You can't talk about rational behavior unless you define the multiple axes or dimensions of what it is to be rational, to avoid states of being that would necessarily be inconsistent or incoherent with the kind of thing that you are. And they have many dimensions, and therefore you need these sort of probabilistic metrics for violating those constraints and thereby inducing this expected cost. I hope that helps to add another, if you like, angle that will enable you to say, look, we need to move away from these arguments about expected utility theory, because they just don't have the right calculus to cope with self-organization and the characteristic kinds and the phenotypes that at the societal level or in the individual level that actually emerge from self-organization. I just briefly go through this because I imagine you're exhausted now and I'm getting tired. But I put a few papers up here, which I suspect you've seen most of them. But it did strike me that there is a little, just as a courteous nod to that conversation about norms and normativity. There are a few people, I don't know these people, and I haven't read this paper, but there have been a few papers coming out recently on applying active inference to normativity. Should that be useful? One particular one, this is by Remy Tyson. I repeat, I haven't read it, but it might or might not be useful from the perspective of your arguments. One I'm more familiar with, I think is probably still under review or trying to find somewhere that will be prepared to publish it. It's interesting, it's a bit technical, but it talks about laws and how you would finesse the problems of legal norms by applying active inference. And they've got a nice example where, again, you couldn't solve with utility theory, where you're trying to cross the road and comply, I think, with, oh no, we're driving a car here, but we're trying to sort of comply with the norms. We don't crash into each other or stop abruptly. And then suddenly, in a different context, you hear an emergency vehicle behind you, and you start behaving illegally. You violate some norms in a context-sensitive way because other norms take priority. So this is being used as to foreground the notion you can't specify norms in one dimension. You've got to have multiple dimensions, and they're all context sensitive. So you have to have a very expressive calculus to describe norms, and then Axel goes ahead and sort of simulates the behaviour of this unfortunate driver caught in front of an ambulance, I presume here. I think this paper is on archives, but it's not been published, so so it might be of use to you. Yeah, why have I put that there? Variational. No. Oh, yeah. So this is another one by Axel. Oh, sorry. Yes, and it's just um, just a nod to one of the questions that you were engaged with about sort of the importance of niche construction, and I think that clearly you're implying there's a lot of niche construction going on that enables the sharing and the emergence of common ground through a sharing of generative models, and there's a nice literature on that from the Toronto group. This was in relation to your conversation with Alexander, and he was saying that, or perhaps you were, that the sum of the surprisals is not the surprisal of the sum. Actually, that's not true. Free energy and surprisal or marginal likelihood, they are called extensive quantities, and therefore the sum of the surprisals of an ensemble is the surprisal of the ensemble. So extensive means you can add things together. Non-extensive quantities you couldn't add together, but you can actually add extensive quantities together. That does actually rest, though, upon all members of the ensemble being conditionally independent, conditioned upon seeing the same environment or seeing the same messages or communication. So I think that's it may or may not be useful to sort of just highlight that. One way I sometimes use that is that if I minimize my surprise in exchange with you, where you are the only thing supplying the sensory evidence for my model of the world, that is you, then if I minimize my surprise about you and you minimize your surprise about me, jointly we're minimizing our joint surprise, and that joint solution just is the generalized synchrony that we were talking about before, that maximizes the mutual information between us. However, that's not the same as saying that the implicit generative model and the free energy of the generative model, where each member of the ensemble now plays the role of encoding a sufficient statistic about the beliefs of the society, is the same thing. That's a different issue. It's a bit more subtle, that one. And this paper tries to address that. So I'm not sure it's going to be useful for your arguments, but it's certainly an interesting question. If I've got lots of little agents with their own generative models that are partially shared, but sufficiently different to assign to all of those agents a particular role, and in particular, assign them to roles as internal states and Markov blanket states, then I can now interpret each of the individuals as a state encoding some belief of the group or the ensemble. And what this paper showed was that if all the individual members have a shared generative model, then the group acts as if its generative model was isomorphic to the individuals. So this it's a bit subtle, but an interesting way of addressing through numerical studies some of the questions you were asking about. Does the institution plan? Does it have beliefs as an institution? You could argue not. You could argue it doesn't plan. You could argue that the institution in and of itself is not described at the right scale that would allow for planning, in the sense that we talk about an active inference agent planning, because it's too coarse-grained at that scale. And the people who actually do the planning at each level are the individual humans at each level doing the actual planning. On the other hand, you could argue at this coarse-grained level, if I so now just describe each person in this organization or its institution in a coarse-grained way in terms of where they were, what they were doing in some sort of coarse-grained way. It may well be that I can now describe in this coarse-grained way the system as self-organizing, and there would be an underlying generative model of a particularly simple kind, usually like a thermostat would have, and I can now describe it doing inference or belief updating under this simple collective generative model. But there is a subtle difference which this paper tries to get at. Again, I'm not absolutely sure it's necessary for your arguments, but I thought I would bring to the table. I just put this paper up just to remind myself that if you wanted to formalize from the perspective of the philosophy of science the notion of scale invariance and what is conserved, it is the dynamics, the processes that are conserved at different scales, then this represents one application to evolutionary thinking. One application of the renormalization group to evolutionary thinking, where the thing that is conserved is exactly this Bayesian mechanics or belief updating. This is a bit historical, but it did, when you were talking about Fair, I thought you were talking about Ernst Fair. So Ernst Fair is a Swiss, quite famous economist who's famous for introducing inequality aversion. And many years ago, we were trying to, this is before active inference, we were trying to understand, is inequality aversion Bayes optimal? And it turns out that if instead of having your value function in the von Neumann-Morgenstern sense, you replace it with our value function, then you can actually show that inequality aversion is actually rational. It's rational. If part of my value, my utility function, comprises your utility function and vice versa, which is basically an old-fashioned way of saying we share the same generative models because we share the same prior preferences, then you can get inequality aversion and fairness in the sense of Ernst Fair for free using standard utility theory. So I thought, well, that would entertain you. It doesn't lend your argument any particular power other than emphasizing that even with economics utility theory or accepted utility theory, you can actually get inequality aversion and a certain kind of fairness and just behavior simply by sharing an important part of the generative model, which is your prior preferences. So that's just covered right in the discussion of this paper. I put this up just because the planning, you don't find planning in everything, but as he was saying, in sophisticated systems, you can always describe them as planning in the sense of looking as if they're choosing those plans that minimize the expected free energy. The particular kind of complicated or sophisticated structure we're talking about is simply one that has a deep hierarchical structure, such that the planning parts of a nested Markov blankets don't have direct access to the actual actions that are eventually enacted or chosen. So it's a particular kind of complexity that just involves a deep architecture where you can't directly see your own action, and therefore your action now becomes the cause of your sensations, and therefore it's something that you infer. And as soon as you infer your own actions, you're effectively doing planning as inference. And at that point, you can use the expected free energy. That's the only reason I put that up there, just to remind myself to say that. You've already spoken about that. This paper just shows that the emergence of a shared generative model, again, is just a natural consequence of a free energy minimizing process. There's nothing magic about it. It's just the most likely thing to happen is the one in which the marginal likelihood is maximized, and the marginal likelihood is maximized when we all have the shared generative model if we share the same sensorium or eco-niche. So it's again almost tautologically true that if societies co-evolve in this sort of scale-free sense, then it has to be the case they have to share a generative model, not only of themselves but also the next scale or the outside or the next territory. And that was the first work of a pure biological spirit, showing the importance of a shared generative model, even if the expression of the shared generative model is very place specific and very context specific. So we all find different roles in our society, in our world, in our eco niche. But that's just because we can contextualize where we should behave in this context, but we all actually share the same pluripotentiality and the same generative model. So again, an interesting example of the necessity to condition prior preferences of a high dimensional sort. Not only are they high dimensional, but they're also context sensitive, and you have to infer the context, recognize where you are in some hierarchy, or where you are in some pattern formation, or where you are in a football team, in order to know what are your preferred, what are the just principles that underwrite your action. So not only is it high dimensional, the utility is also extremely context dependent, and that's it.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Carl, and thank you so much, Majid. Majid, please go ahead if you want to react.
Thank you very much. I know that, I mean, it is very late, but could I say a few quick things? Yeah. So I'm very grateful, Carl, for your generous feedback. I mean, and generous tips. I mean, so this was a project that I wanted to do in 10 years, utilitarianism, but you just did that for me with few masterful stroke in few moments. So, and so about sophisticated agents, the last thing that you mentioned. So I think that in the same way, justice is precisely something that happens in all kinds of free energy minimizing systems. But when we make it global and we make it sophisticated enough, it becomes theory of justice, in the same way that agency is something that happens in all kinds of free energy minimizing system, but it is just more sophisticated and so on. So this was one point. About the first point that you mentioned about Rawls' first mistake about calling it equilibrium, whereas it is not really an equilibrium. So I'm going to just show very quickly so this is the first paper. Can you see that?
Yep.
This is the first paper that I wrote. I mean, reflective non-equilibrium and non-constructive account of justice, and it has been rejected everywhere. So because I was submitting it mainly to philosophical papers, philosophy and public affairs and so on, and they just were saying that this is just a big nonsense. I mean, reflecting non-equilibrium doesn't make any sense. So I'm very